Caught my wife texting her ex about meeting up while I was pulling double shifts to pay for her dream wedding, so I canceled everything and used the venue deposit for my own fresh start. Sometimes the universe has a twisted sense of humor about timing, and sometimes that timing saves you from making the biggest mistake of your life. I'm Jake, 29, and I work as a construction foreman here in Phoenix, specializing in commercial building projects that keep me busy but pay well enough to build a decent life. Beth, my now ex-fiancée, is 27 and splits her time between part-time fitness instruction at various CrossFit gyms around the city and freelance social media management when she feels motivated enough to actually follow through on client work. We'd been together for 5 solid years and engaged for 8 months, ever since I proposed at the same CrossFit gym where we first met when I was trying to get back in shape after a work injury left me hobbling around for 3 months. She was teaching a beginner's class, and I was the guy in the back struggling to do a proper burpee without looking like a dying fish, but something about her energy and the way she encouraged even the most hopeless cases like myself made me want to stick around. The relationship developed naturally from there, gym sessions turning into coffee dates becoming weekend hikes in the desert, and eventually her moving into my apartment after about 18 months when her lease was up and it made financial sense. I'd insisted on a prenup when we got engaged, not because I didn't trust Beth, but because my father went through an absolutely devastating divorce that nearly bankrupted him and taught me some hard lessons about protecting yourself legally. Beth agreed without any hesitation or drama, saying she completely understood wanting to protect premarital assets and that she'd never want to take anything I'd worked for before we were together. The wedding planning, however, had become Beth's full-time obsession, particularly her fixation on this incredibly expensive venue at a resort in Sedona that cost $45,000 just for the weekend package, not including catering, photography, flowers, or any of the other endless expenses that kept appearing on her spreadsheets. The problem was that this dream wedding was far beyond our current budget since we'd been aggressively paying down my truck loan and her student debt from the various fitness certification programs she'd accumulated over the years, most of which she'd started but never quite finished. So I did what any guy does when his future wife has her heart set on something that costs more than a luxury car. I started picking up every double shift and weekend construction gig I could find, working 70 to 80-hour weeks for 3 months straight to make Beth's Sedona dream a reality. The overtime pay was decent, but the exhaustion was brutal, coming home most nights after 10 p.m. covered in dust and concrete, barely having energy to shower before collapsing into bed while Beth scrolled through Pinterest boards of centerpiece ideas and color schemes. Her best friend Vanessa, a divorce software developer with strong opinions about everything, had started coming over frequently to help with wedding planning during my long work days, spreading vendor catalogs and fabric samples across our dining table like they were planning a military operation. Vanessa always made these subtle comments about how I was never around anymore and how Beth deserved someone who prioritized her, but I figured she was just bitter about her own failed marriage and didn't take it seriously. The discovery that changed everything happened on a Tuesday evening when equipment broke down at the job site and we got sent home 3 hours early, giving me a rare opportunity to surprise Beth with takeout from her favorite Thai place and maybe actually spend some time together for once. I walked into our apartment around 7:30, calling out that I was home early, and heard the shower running while Beth's phone buzzed repeatedly on the kitchen counter where she'd left it charging. The preview messages were visible on the lock screen, and the name, Ryan M., immediately caught my attention because I recognized it as Beth's ex-boyfriend from college, someone she'd always claimed to have zero contact with since they broke up 4 years before we met. The preview text said something about meeting times and being careful about timing, which seemed odd for someone she supposedly never talked to anymore. My stomach dropped as I read the visible portions, "We should pick up where we left off," and "when Jake's working those long hours," and something about planning to see if the spark is still there. I didn't touch her phone, but I could see enough of the conversation thread to realize this wasn't some innocent rekindling of friendship. These were messages between two people planning something they knew they shouldn't be doing. The messages revealed they'd been texting for weeks, with Ryan apparently saying he'd been thinking about her since moving back to Phoenix and that seeing her engagement photos on social media made him realize he'd made a mistake letting her go years ago. Standing there in my work clothes, exhausted from busting my ass to pay for a wedding she was apparently having second thoughts about, I felt this cold clarity settle over me, like I was looking at financial statements that didn't add up and finally seeing where the numbers were wrong. Over the next few days, Beth started acting completely different, like someone had swapped out my confident, decisive fiancé for this anxious, uncertain version who kept bringing up wedding stress in ways that felt rehearsed and calculated. She'd mention casually over morning coffee how overwhelming everything had become and whether we might be rushing into marriage too young, especially with all the financial pressure I was putting myself under working these brutal hours. Maybe we should postpone the wedding a few months, she suggested one evening while I was reviewing vendor invoices at the kitchen table, just to save more money and reduce all this stress, you know? I've been having some anxiety about such a big commitment, and Vanessa thinks that's totally normal. The way she kept bringing up Vanessa's opinions started grating on me, like she needed her divorced friend's permission to feel uncertain about our relationship. Then came the hypothetical questions that weren't hypothetical at all, delivered with this fake casual tone while she scrolled through her phone. Do you think it's possible to love someone but still wonder about past relationships? Like, is it normal to have cold feet before a major life decision? I'd look up from whatever I was doing and study her face, searching for signs of guilt or deception, but she'd avoid eye contact and keep talking. Vanessa says I should take some time for myself before the wedding, maybe go on a girls' trip to clear my head and make sure I'm marrying for the right reasons, not just because it's what's expected. The girls' trip idea felt like a convenient excuse to create distance and probably see Ryan without me around, but I played along, asking supportive questions while mentally preparing for what I already knew was coming. When I finally asked directly if there was someone else or if she was genuinely having second thoughts about us, Beth got immediately defensive in that way people do when they're caught in something they can't quite admit yet. "I would never cheat on you, Jake. How could you even ask me that?" she said, her voice rising with artificial indignation. "It's just that Vanessa's been pointing out how I've never really been single as an adult, you know? I went straight from dating Ryan in college to being with you, and maybe I never figured out who I am on my own." There it was. Ryan's name dropped into the conversation like it was some innocent observation instead of the real reason behind all her sudden uncertainty. The manipulation was almost impressive in its transparency, the way she was using Vanessa as a shield for her own doubts while simultaneously testing whether I'd fight for the relationship or give her the space she was clearly angling for to explore whatever was happening with her ex. Instead of confronting Beth immediately and giving her the dramatic scene she seemed to be building toward, I decided to handle this situation the same way I approach construction projects, methodically and with a clear plan before breaking ground. I quietly consulted a lawyer during my lunch break the next day, explaining the situation and making sure I understood my rights regarding our shared expenses and the prenup we'd signed. The attorney confirmed what I suspected, that since we weren't married yet and most of the wedding expenses had come from my overtime earnings, I had every legal right to cancel everything and recover whatever money I could. That evening, while Beth was at Vanessa's place having another one of their planning sessions, I spread out all our wedding vendor contracts on the dining table and started making calls. Turns out most vendors have cancellation policies that allow you to back out with varying penalty fees, and I realized I could recover the majority of the money I'd been absolutely killing myself to earn over the past 3 months. The Sedona venue was the biggest hit. I'd lose the $5,000 deposit, but I could get back the remaining $40,000 in payments I'd already made from all those double shifts and weekend gigs. The catering company charged a 15% cancellation fee, the photographer wanted 10%, and the band was surprisingly cool about it, only keeping $200 for administrative costs. By the time I finished making calls, I'd recovered about $15,000 in various deposits, eating small cancellation fees but keeping the bulk of money that would have gone toward a wedding for someone who was apparently shopping around for better options. I opened a new bank account the next morning before my shift started and moved all the recovered wedding funds plus my construction overtime earnings, about $32,000 total, into an account that only I could access. The irony wasn't lost on me that Beth's dream wedding fund was about to become my fresh start fund, but that felt like poetic justice for someone who'd been planning to meet up with her ex while I worked myself into the ground for her happiness. I also started quietly looking at apartments online during my breaks, realizing that our lease was month to month and I could relocate quickly once I finally confronted her about the Ryan situation and whatever fantasies she'd been entertaining about picking up where they left off. Friday night, I planned what would be our final romantic dinner together, complete with candles, her favorite wine, and takeout from that expensive Italian place she always wanted to try but we could never justify the cost. I acted enthusiastic about our future, telling her I had exciting news about our wedding plans that would solve all the stress she'd been feeling lately. Beth seemed nervous throughout dinner, barely touching her food and bringing up the idea of scaling back the wedding, maybe doing something smaller and more intimate instead of the big Sedona production she'd been obsessing over for months. Actually, I said, refilling her wine glass with a smile, I've taken care of all the financial stress completely. You don't have to worry about any of it anymore. Her face brightened for a split second before I continued. I canceled everything. The venue, the catering, the photographer, the band, all of it. The color drained from her face like someone had pulled a plug. You what? Jake, what are you talking about? Why would you cancel our wedding? I pulled out my phone and showed her the email confirmations, each cancellation notice timestamped over the past 3 days. Because I found your texts with Ryan, and I know you've been planning to meet up with your ex while stringing me along as some kind of backup plan. Her mouth opened and closed like she was drowning, cycling through shock, denial, and then that familiar defensive anger. You went through my phone? How dare you invade my privacy like that, Jake? You had no right to cancel our wedding without even discussing it with me first. I set my phone on the table between us. I didn't go through anything, Beth. Your messages were right there on the lock screen when you left your phone on the counter. Hard to miss texts about picking up where you left off and meeting while I'm working those long hours. She tried the innocent friend approach first. Ryan's just an old friend who reached out. There's nothing going on between us. You're completely overreacting and ruining everything over nothing. But when I started reading the specific messages I'd memorized, about seeing if the spark was still there and being careful about timing, she couldn't explain them away. Her strategy shifted to righteous indignation about the money. How am I supposed to explain to everyone that our wedding is canceled? What happened to all the money we saved together, Jake? You can't just steal our wedding fund because you're paranoid and insecure. The fact that she was more concerned about explaining the situation to others and accessing the money than addressing her emotional affair told me everything I needed to know about her priorities and where I actually ranked in her life. Beth moved in with Vanessa temporarily, but instead of taking time to reflect on her choices, she launched what could only be described as a full-scale manipulation campaign designed to win me back and gain access to the wedding funds she'd apparently decided were partially hers. The first phase involved showing up at my construction sites during lunch breaks, creating scenes in front of my crew that were both embarrassing and completely unprofessional. Jake, we need to talk about this like adults, she'd announce, marching onto an active job site wearing impractical shoes and drawing stares from everyone within hearing distance. You're being controlling and financially abusive by stealing money I helped plan the spending for. My foreman pulled me aside after the third incident and told me I needed to handle my personal drama away from the worksite, which was humiliating but completely understandable from his perspective. The second phase targeted my family, with Beth calling my mother and siblings to explain that I was having some kind of breakdown and had canceled our wedding over innocent text messages with an old friend. I'm really worried about Jake's mental state, she told my sister, who called me immediately afterward. He's being completely irrational and paranoid, canceling everything we've worked toward without even trying to talk through his concerns like a mature adult would. My family knew me well enough to see through her manipulation, but it was still infuriating that she was trying to paint me as unstable for refusing to subsidize her backup plan. Things escalated when she started filing complaints with my contracting company, claiming I was potentially dangerous on job sites and emotionally unstable around heavy equipment and power tools. This forced me to have an incredibly uncomfortable meeting with my supervisor and HR department, explaining our personal situation while trying to maintain my professional reputation and reassure them that my work performance hadn't been affected by relationship drama. Meanwhile, Vanessa was working her own angle, calling friends and coworkers from our social circle with this concerned friend routine about how devastated Beth was and how unreasonable I was being about harmless text messages. He's completely controlling her finances and isolating her from old friends, Vanessa would say, fishing for information about my living situation and trying to turn mutual friends against me. The financial manipulation attempt was almost predictable. Beth tried to use our shared credit cards for various expenses and discovered I'd already removed her as an authorized user on everything. This led to angry confrontations where she demanded access to our wedding fund and threatened legal action, apparently unaware that the prenup she'd signed so willingly covered exactly this type of situation. The final escalation was both pathetic and disturbing. Beth created fake social media accounts to contact women I'd dated before her, trying to dig up dirt or find evidence of me cheating to justify her own behavior and shift the narrative in her favor. Beth's desperation reached its peak when she apparently decided to escalate from manipulation to intimidation, enlisting Ryan to help her confront me in what I can only assume they thought would be some kind of dramatic romantic intervention. I was relaxing at my apartment on a Sunday evening, actually enjoying the peace and quiet for the first time in months, when someone started pounding on my door like they were trying to break it down. Through the peephole, I saw Ryan standing there with his chest puffed out, clearly working himself up for some kind of confrontation he'd probably been planning since Beth recruited him for this ridiculous mission. "Open up, man, we need to talk about how you're treating Beth," he shouted through the door, loud enough that my neighbors probably thought I was harboring a fugitive. "You're going to give her what she deserves, or I'm going to handle this situation myself." The threats escalated from there, with Ryan demanding I treat Beth right and give her access to her fair share of the wedding money, apparently unaware that his girlfriend's ex-fiancé had zero legal obligation to fund their rekindled romance. When I refused to open the door and told him to leave or I'd call the police, he started getting physical with my front door, trying to force his way in while making increasingly specific threats about what would happen if I didn't cooperate with their financial demands. I called 911 and recorded everything on my phone, which turned out to be incredibly smart because Ryan's behavior gave me everything I needed for a restraining order that was approved within 48 hours. The police report and my documentation of Beth's harassment campaign made it clear that this wasn't just a relationship dispute, but a coordinated effort to intimidate me into giving them money I'd earned through my own overtime work. Beth's final attempt at reconciliation came the next week, when she showed up at my apartment alone, crying and admitting that yes, she had been planning to meet Ryan, but claiming it was just for closure and that seeing my reaction made her realize I was the only man she truly wanted. "I was confused and scared about getting married so young," she said through tears that looked genuine for the first time in months. "Ryan represented this fantasy of my past, but watching you protect yourself and stand up for what's right made me see who you really are." It was almost convincing, the way she described realizing that I was stable and dependable while Ryan was just an immature guy chasing a married woman, but I knew this was just another manipulation tactic designed to regain access to the security I represented. Instead of falling for her performance, I used the $32,000 in recovered wedding funds as a down payment on a small house in a better neighborhood, effectively using Beth's dream wedding money to start my new single life in a place that was entirely mine. The symbolism wasn't lost on me, transforming money I'd earned killing myself for someone else's fantasy into the foundation of my own independence and future stability. Beth and Vanessa kept trying to harass me through mutual friends and social media, spreading stories about how I'd financially abused Beth and stolen money that belonged to both of us, but I blocked all contact and focused on my new living situation and the business ideas I'd been developing. The prenup protected me legally from any claims she might have made about shared assets, and Beth was eventually forced to move back in with her parents when Vanessa got tired of supporting someone who couldn't contribute to rent or utilities. Meanwhile, I was thriving in my new house, using the remaining money to invest in my own contracting business and finally pursuing the entrepreneurial goals I'd put on hold while funding someone else's dreams. Beth had to explain the failed engagement to family and friends who had already made travel arrangements for the Sedona wedding, which apparently involved a lot of awkward conversations about how her fiancé had stolen their wedding money over innocent text messages with an old friend. The final update came through mutual friends about 6 months later, Ryan and Beth's rekindled relationship had lasted exactly 2 months before imploding in spectacular fashion when he realized she expected him to fund the same lifestyle I'd been supporting. By that time, I'd successfully launched my own construction company, hired 2 employees, and started dating again with a much clearer understanding of red flags and what genuine partnership actually looks like, while Beth was apparently still living with her parents and trying to rebuild her fitness instruction career after burning bridges with clients who'd heard about the wedding drama.